Hello, welcome. All right, so let me get the names down. And we're doing an assignment whereby we're about three ahead. So at least one appointment next week, we're going to cancel because we're getting too far ahead. All right. And I realize this would eventually happen. So I hope you're okay with that. So matter of fact, I'll go ahead and decide right now. Next Tuesday's meeting is off. All right. We'll still be ahead even if we do Thursday. And I'll
I
let
only said thank you because Tuesdays is the day my classes clash. So
exactly.
yeah, I'm glad you chose Tuesday. Thanks.
No problem. So yeah, absolutely. We'll go ahead and do that, okay? Because yeah, we're getting far ahead. And like I said, there's no neat schedule as far as because it averages about 1.5, right? Mathematically, 1.5 Zoom meeting per week, and we've been doing two every week. So I knew this would eventually happen, that we'll get too far ahead of schedule. All right, so let me get your names down, and we will begin to go over this assignment. All right, so let's see here. Lynn. All right. And Destiny. Pardon me. Let's see here. Where are you? I'm sorry to ask Destiny again. I know I've asked this before. What's your last name, hon?
It's Acevedo. I'll put it in the chat.
Up at the top. I'm sorry. I gotcha. Thank you. All right. So let's go ahead and share the screen. So remember, we're doing great man history of the early republic. That doesn't imply that these were great, morally, ethically great men. It deals with causation in history under the assumption that if you want to know why or how history went in the direction that it did, look at the people in the great positions of power. Look at their personalities, their decisions, what made them do what they do. And that's the explanation. It's an old school form of historiography that's a little bit passe, but just because now that we do history from below, we do social history, cultural history, which are wonderful. I don't think you need to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think every now and then it does a disservice to not properly go over who the president was at a given time and what he or she did or did not do, et cetera, et cetera. All right. So all in good balance. But notice this is the only time that I do that in class, where I do pretty much every number on great man history, on the presidents of the time period. Okay. So keep that in mind. There's more to the story. With number one, right? You're just saying that I make the subjective argument that, those like when the Gironde were controlling the French Revolution, those who wanted great change from tradition and history, they sat on the left wing of the deputies chamber. And those who wanted to adhere to a lot of tradition, supposedly, and were more conservative, wanted to conserve the status quo, sat on the right side of that deputies chamber. And the name has stuck to this day. So left wing, someone wanting great change from tradition, and right wing, someone either regressive and wanting to go back to the good old days, or being conservative and wanting to conserve the way things were at that time, the status quo. Okay. And so with our left and right, the popular guys, right, that normally I do a PowerPoint on are Thomas Jefferson on the left and Alexander Hamilton on the right. All right. As well as John Adams on the right. And so when you look at the figures on the right, they were for at one time having a president serve for life, having him called His Elective Majesty. They wanted the central government to be rather unitary and having a lot of powers over the states. They worried about, as found in the Federalist Papers, 87 little short essays that were written in favor of this Constitution and this less democratic, more centralized republic that we have today as opposed to the Articles of Confederation. They were more worried about the masses and lobbyist groups from the local and state levels becoming tyrannical than they were about a cadre of Washington, D.C. folk becoming tyrannical. So yes, they were old school conservative and to the right in that respect. They also spoke about the better sort running government. The idea is, right, as if I asked you the rhetorical question, do you believe everyone is equally entitled to the same rights, protections, and privileges as an American citizen? And of course, your answer should be yes. But then I asked you rhetorically, do you believe that everyone is equally capable of fixing your car or writing a history paper for you, etc., right? And the answer to that rhetorical question is meant to be no, right? That people differ in talents, they differ in experience, etc. So they wanted the better sort. They wanted those who were of the leisure class, who had time to read and receive a classical education, to be elected as the leaders and to be appointed in the appointed groups as well, feeling that they had been groomed to govern as opposed to a hardworking farmer in North Carolina. And so they had a form of elitism to them. They wanted a stronger central government. They also did not adhere to Adam Smith's principles too well, as far as laissez-faire economics, right? Of the government, let it be, let economic actions freely occur without government intervention. They were more along the old school British model of mercantilism, whereby they wanted the government to intervene in the economy and have more of a planned economy, right? And I find this interesting is that the liberals today want more of a planned economy, but for different reasons, right? They say ostensibly to help the marginalized and help those who were left out. But the liberals of this time period were more libertarian. The government don't tread on me, keep government small, weak, decentralized, localized, and more accountable. And so going to the left, but staying on the right actually just for a moment longer, some of them were quasi almost abolitionists, like Alexander Hamilton. And so they were for having checks and balances. Montesquieu's work was highly instrumental to them as well as to others. So they wanted a two-house legislator, one that was elected and one that was not directly elected. They wanted checks and balances between the executive and the legislator. They believed in the consent of the governed with the social contract and that premise. And like I said, some of them were abolitionists, John Adams and his son, etc. So hence they weren't, consistently along the lines uber conservatives. They weren't that far to the right, I subjectively think. And then you look to the left. On the left, right, they did want to err on the side of having too much democracy as opposed to an aristocracy, a group of the cadre of the elite, well-educated, because they didn't take for granted the notion of Greco-Roman education, making a more ethically refined person out of you. They felt that you could just become a more shrewd and educated crook with more education, and hence it can make some very pernicious decisions as an elite man of leisure. And so they feared that more than they feared the masses. But at the same time, those on the left did concede, like Thomas Jefferson, that the people not yet having undergone a national level institution of public education, that the average people, that there is a degree to which it's like giving the car over to someone who's never been through driver's training. So they did adhere to some of the conservative notions of Plato and Aristotle, that the average person is not real prepared and well equipped to rule, and that the average person is going to, out of ignorance and out of appetite, right, adhering to his id, if you will, his primary urges, is going to make some poor decisions, some rash decisions, some selfish decisions, etc., that can be harmful to the republic. But to them, they felt like having a republic that was more democratic than anything else was a lesser evil. Certainly not a panacea, but a lesser evil. So my point being is they really weren't that far to the left. As far as wanting human rights, right, inalienable rights for all human beings, as the Enlightenment countenanced, as well as the Great Awakening, they didn't adhere to that. They were okay with every state deciding on who could be a citizen and who could not, and they largely adhered to the old English European traditional maxim that only English men, English ethnically, historically English men who own property ought to be participants in the republic. So much for rights for women. You look at Jefferson and his writings, a lot of essentialist, male chauvinist ideas about women. Also essentialist, racist notions about African Americans, as opposed to like Benjamin Franklin with Native Americans, right? Benjamin Franklin was more consistent with the Enlightenment in saying that Native Americans, he felt, were not as civilized simply because of the political development or lack thereof of their histories. And they just hadn't yet been put in the right environment and hadn't yet become equipped to become good citizens. But that could happen, that naturally, inherently, as human beings, they shared the same capabilities as any other human being. Jefferson didn't adhere to that. He did a little bit with Native Americans, but not with women and not with African Americans. And of course, those on the far left, oftentimes, however begrudgingly, conceded to slavery. So much for being radical on the left, right? Another litmus test for how radical you may or may not be being on the left at this time period was land redistribution. That was a radical notion of the French Revolution, of some of the writings of some of the people like Charles Fourier and others, roughly at this time, a little bit later. They didn't go that far. Jefferson in the government of Virginia wanted to give out Native American lands to poor white men and give them enough for a freehold to start a life and to become citizens, etc. But he didn't volunteer any of Monticello, right? Any of his own plantation, anything like radical land redistribution. So I would say that the left was really not that far to the left either, as the right wasn't that far to the right. If you contrast this just a generation later with Latin America, I think you get a much more pronounced gap between left and right. You're going to get people who believe in the divine right of an emperor or a king and no representative government, no checks and balances, no social contract and consent of the governed in Latin America, that you don't have on the right in the United States. Likewise, on the left, you're going to get people in Latin America who are for universal enfranchisement for everyone, every human, an inhabitant, to become a free participant in the republic, right? For very democratic forms of government, against slavery and for the abolition of slavery and universal citizenship, and also for land redistribution. So I make the argument that I subjectively don't think that our gap between left and right on the political spectrum was that broad in our early republic. And I think in the short run, it yielded short-term benefit of peaceful transitions of power. I think when Washington became the first president and it became apparent by the end of his second term that he was on the right, when John Adams was elected president next, and he clearly vocally was on the right, but then Thomas Jefferson was elected in 1800 and he vocalized being on the left. that you didn't have a coup, you didn't have a revolution, you didn't have a civil war, because I think deep down they knew they were not that fundamentally far apart on the political spectrum. That a lot of the rhetoric that you see during presidential elections was, I think, subjectively hyperbole, that it was strategic, deliberate exaggeration, trying to get the voters to become scared of, frightened of voting for their oppositional candidate, right? And exaggerating just how far to the left or to the right that candidate really was. All right. But in the long run, I think it helped led to things like the Civil War, because they wouldn't embrace not even the left would embrace fundamental notions that I've mentioned, like universal enfranchisement, right? Citizenship for everybody. And so the quote Negro problem down in the South is not going to be resolved because the left wouldn't go that far. And so in that extent, right, with the bigger issues like that, they kicked that problem down the street. They kicked that can down the road and forced that problem to be embraced and faced by future generations, right? So I think that narrow gap between left and right was bittersweet. That's just me. So on number one, what I'm saying is image, right? I don't know if I'd go so far as say is image is everything, but if someone becomes perceived to become excessively conservative, excessively liberal, that it is going to bring, whether it's true or not, it's going to bring about real tangible results, right? And that's where we're going with number one. It's not saying necessarily that Hamilton and Washington's administration were excessively conservative, although some might say that, but that the image of them was just that they conveyed the image of being too far to the right, and that this is going to provoke an oppositional party and become the birth of our two-party system that we have, that you don't find in the Constitution, right? And Washington did not want. So the opposition, the liberal opposition, is going to become fed up and organize into what they perceive to be the excesses of particularly Alexander Hamilton as the Secretary of the Treasury under George Washington. And when you look at the narrative, oftentimes when you do like great man history of George Washington, you read a biography, etc., you find the juxtaposition of the fact that he did seem to be rather conservative from the get-go. He was not much of a democratic man as far as having faith in the sagacity, right, and the worldly wisdom of the common American citizen being entrusted with governmental decisions. He definitely held himself aloof as the military leader and then later as the political leader from his people. And some of that was instinctive because of his personality, it seems. But some of it also was strategic, in that he wasn't here to make friends, right? He wanted to ensure that this new government, because remember, we had tried one before this and it failed. That's an important thing to remember, is he and John Adams and these other conservative writers, you look at their writings, they had they expressed a great fear of this new government not lasting. And so hence he wanted to put an aura of prestige to the president, knowing that he was going to be the president for just 2 terms and step down, knowing that in the future he wanted that type of role for the president to be an adhesive from different factions. Remember, a faction is a group that shares the same self-interest or same ideology. He knew that we would be riddled with factions, people that did the same thing for a living, people who lived in the same region and had the same self-interest in that region, like North versus South, right? Agricultural versus manufacturing based. I know that's simplistic of a dichotomy this early, but it already was happening. And so he wanted the president to be someone that everyone held a sense of awe for, right? that would be like an adhesive to hold all these disparate factions together in their loyalty to this person who was the president. But at the same time, he wanted to make it clear that he was not a king, right? Like King George III, as critics would contend, right? We're going to have King George IV with George Washington, right? So he had, for instance, press conferences. He went on goodwill tours and kissed babies and shook hands. With the press conferences, that was big, right? He did that even before the First Amendment with the freedom of the press and so forth was passed in, I believe, 1793. He wanted to convey the image that, hey, I'm not a king, I'm not the crown, I'm the first person of the republic. And it goes back to his notions of civic virtue with leaders and writers of Rome like Cicero and Tacitus, who fought for Roman legions and then became senators and were patricians, were well-to-do men and leaders of Rome, but who lived very simplistic, Spartan-like lives and gave to their public, did what was best for the entire country, not just one faction of Americans. So he tried to convey that image, and he tried to live that out, arguably, to try to be a source of adhesion, of like glue, to keep the left and right together, all right, and try not to alienate at either side. When he chose his cabinet, he chose Southerners and Northerners. He chose members of the left and members of the right. Same thing when he arguably, to an extent, when he chose the first 6, I don't know why they chose an even number, but the first 6 Supreme Court justices of the Supreme Court. Some Northerners, some Southerners, some a little to the left, some a little to the right. All right. So he tries to mark that line. And the popular image was that he felt more precarious, more insecure, more fearful in trying to hold the country together than he ever was as the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. That he was more afraid as our civic leader than he had been as our commanding military leader during the War for Independence. Nevertheless, according to number 1, he gives too long of a leash to Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton plays the villain in number 1. All right. The fact that he could choose a cabinet, right? Well, right off the bat, his Secretary of State, right, in charge of diplomacy with all other foreign countries, had about 4 members in his department. 4 members, right? And then I'm reading here from The Federalist Era by John C. Miller. I'm reading off of page 33. In 1789, the office of Secretary of the Treasury was second in importance only to that of the president. As organized under the Act of Congress of September 1789, the Treasury was the largest of the departments, consisting of an assistant, controller, treasurer, auditor, register, and over 30 clerks. Over 30, right? That's puny by today's standards of our bureaucracy, but relative to the other departments, it was big, right? And then you have to remember also is that, Article 1, Section 8 gave power of regulating interstate trade and devising imposts and import taxes and internal taxes, right, to Congress. And now this is the executive branch, right? The branch that is associated with the king and queen prior to the War for Independence, right? And so here he is, and he comes and gives a famous speech, his State of the Union address on the economy to Congress. And the notion is that he pretty much was telling them what he was going to do, whether they liked it or not, and what needed to be done for the country's sake, etc. So he plays a part in really running rampant and giving the executive more power than it ever, claiming more power for it than the original subscribers to the Constitution imagined or wanted or consented to. Okay. So what he does, right, is one of the constitutionally dubious things he does is he taxes. Remember, all taxes are supposed to emanate from the House of Reps. he directly taxes, and he's not an elected official. Remember taxation without representation? That was a big cry of ours, right? That's kind of ironic, right? It's also ironic that he taxes luxury goods like tea and alcohol, right? And so at any rate, he's already, earning a villainous name for himself on the left. Then he also takes over the debts of the states. And remember, if you think like a good libertarian, in the short run, that's wonderful for the states, right? For those that were heavily indebted. But what the government does for good today, it could do for your harm tomorrow, if you're thinking like a good libertarian. So now, right, Washington, D.C., although they were initially in New York, but I still symbolically will call it D.C. if that's okay. D.C. is taking control of South Carolina's debts, right? And so it's infringing upon state budgets, etc. And then they start passing laws in Congress, because remember, they had a Federalist Congress as well, the right-wing party, the Federalists. They had a majority in Congress. So they were working in cahoots with the executive. And remember, you're supposed to be almost, as Madison had written, you're supposed to be jealous of one another, right? In different branches, and not want to give over any powers or much cooperation to the other branch, because the key is not efficiency, right? Arguably the Third Reich under Nazi Germany was efficient, and that's not a good thing, right? You want prevention of tyranny. That just permeated all the writings and the discourse at that time. You don't want tyranny. And so here is the legislator cooperating and empowering the central government and empowering the executive department. Okay, so they passed import taxes, and they went anywhere from like 6 cents a ton to 50 cents a ton on manufactured goods and molasses and a few other enumerated products that came in, and to protect our infant industries, the industries that were beginning to take off. And when you crunch your numbers and you look at the overhead that you have to pay, and you look at the limited budget that you're working with, you could only go so low on the price of your product, right? Before you run out of business. Someone who has a leg up on you, who has more capital to play with, who has been in business longer and has better machinery, etc., they could afford to pull a Walmart on you, right, through economies of scale, and they could undersell you with a lower price and a higher quality product. And so we're protecting our manufacturers and putting these taxes on manufactured imported goods. But who pays for that, at least in the short run? The consumer, right? Because it's putting pressure to buy the more expensive American-made product rather than the cheaper, higher quality foreign-made product from Flanders or from England. And so, and who is it clearly helping? It's helping the manufacturers. Now, did they put an equal import tax on competing cotton from India or Egypt, right, to help out the Southern planters? No, they did not. They didn't have enough reps in Congress to pass that. And so it didn't pass. And so it seems as if, right, this first Congress is favoring the manufacturing faction, right? The Northern industrial faction over the Southerners in particular. And so that's kind of strike two, if you would. And so then, in order to, Hamilton wants to subsidize industries for which he believes their success will help benefit the entire country. And notice, this is kind of bipartisan to this day. I remember the Liberal Democratic Party in the 1990s, and as you get later on in the latter half of US history under FDR and the New Deal, the Democrats will pay farmers not to farm, right? To get supply and demand back in equal balance. They will pay software workers in the Silicon Valley. They will subsidize them to try to compete with other countries with software, etc. But now at this time, the idea of subsidizing, it seemed anathema. It seemed like blasphemy to the leftist libertarians, because this is exactly what Adam Smith said needed to end, right? Let the economy do its thing, government stay out. Because after all, who had helped manufacturers before? Who had helped fund public works before? Great Britain, when we were under Great Britain. So this all seems to be regressive, like we're trying to emulate our old enemy. Okay.
But was there any reason Alexander Hamilton did that he didn't support the Southern farmers that much?
You know what? I don't have any direct quotes that are coming to mind, Mr. Virag, with the Southerners. I do know certainly that his rationale in general for his whole policy was pragmatism, right? As he said, hey, I'm not an idealist like Jefferson, who wants to have this this collection of hundreds, like from Plato and from English Whig oppositional writers, where you have villages of 100 people be semi-autonomous and democratically run their own region and government and decide upon their own resources, etc. He said, I'm a practical person, and I think that if we don't become an economic powerhouse and pay off our debt and start to build an infrastructure and start to diversify and develop and manufacture all the products that we can, so we can become self-sufficient, that we will become prey to European powers, that they'll try to take us over again. I mean, it was no less dramatic than that in his thinking. And so to him, it was all about pragmatism, just becoming an industrialized, self-sufficient economic giant, right? But as far as the debates with the South and the grievances of the South, I apologize, Mr. Virag. I don't have any quotes directly that are coming to mind, because I'm sure from inferring from the way he handled other things, on the one hand, he was very, very unapologetically to the right, did not mind offending people with his rhetoric and so forth. But I think even he knew what a tender topic that was. And I think he would have, there was a degree to which he would have uncharacteristically walked a little bit on eggshells on that subject. Because I think you find some very prescient writings by this very first generation of founding fathers worried about something tantamount to a civil war and a secession of the southern states. So yeah, I'm sorry, Mr. Virag. I should have a better answer prepared than that.
So what you said about the cotton farmers, that they didn't put the tax on the imported cotton, it just doesn't seem that logical to me, because they were also manufacturing clothes and they could have exported. The land was good to produce a lot of cotton, so that would have been used in the economy. No,
right, for sure.
Yeah.
And one thing though, however, for the best interest, sadly, of the textile, because the clothing making industry was one of the earliest industries that developed in the North. They sadly profited from being able to buy cheaper, higher quality Egyptian and Indian cotton. And so it actually was in their economic best interest not to put an import tariff on that cotton, as selfish as that was.
Hamilton should have known better that using the cotton that's right there is eventually in time is much better than getting it from the other side of the world. No,
absolutely, absolutely, and it would have been in line with what Yeah, and it would have been in line with his notion of self-sufficiency, right?
Mhm.
Is we don't
Yeah.
want to become reliant upon any single foreign-made product.
Yeah.
And so absolutely. And all I could say in addition to that is recall that this was this decision was made and it was passed by simple majority in Congress.
Mhm.
So Hamilton, you know, he wasn't directly involved in that. He was in the executive, he was a secretary of the treasury. He wasn't a House rep or senator. And so it wasn't his doing, but still with the amount of prestige and power that he had, you know, shame on me for not knowing, not recalling or having read yet what he may have felt incumbent upon him as a leader to do or say about that topic. Because you're absolutely right. I think that because, you know, later on, people who emulated him, like Henry Clay, Henry Clay made it very clear that the tariff should be equitable, that the tariff, he was for Hamilton's plan for the country, but that the tariff ought to apply to manufactured products as well. And that not just out of fairness for the Southern faction, as far as, you know, kind of quid pro quo, you help us and we'll help you, but also just in the fact of self-sufficiency, right, as a country, and developing our own cotton, etc. Because not until the antebellum period have I read people, you know, opposed to the agricultural tariff for abolitionist means, right, and trying to take away the power of the planter slave owners. That's going to come into play later, but I don't see that yet. So yeah, that's a great question that I had a pretty weak answer to, Mr. Virag, and I apologize,
Oh, it was perfect. Thank you.
but that was a great question. And so, but the revenue from the imposts, you know, and I like I mentioned, anything from just 6 cents a ton up to a few products up to 50 cents a ton, even back then, was not too burdensome. And the tax on alcohol and tea, again, I don't recall the exact amount, but it was pretty negligible from my memory. So here he is trying to pay off the state's debts, the national debt. He's trying to subsidize certain industries, right? That's not enough money. So what does he do is he starts the bond system, right? Whereby you buy bond certificates as a private individual to lend money to the government. And then it promises to pay you back through that bond certificate, the money that you lent the government plus interest, right? But let's face it, who has the money on the side to lend money to the government and for it to take years to get that money back, right? To get your money back, the wealthy. And so right off the bat, in his circles, right, he began to spend most of his time and try to garner most of his resources from the wealthiest of Americans, especially in New York, where he was from, where he was originally from the Danish Caribbean, but you know what I mean. He went to Columbia College and began his political career in New York, and that's where his roots ended up being. And so at any rate, he not only did the bond campaign, but he establishes, right, a national bank, a bank of the United States. And nowhere in Article 2 nor in Article 1 for Congress can you find anything of that, right? As far as being able, having the constitutional right to have a national bank. And it was kind of like the Federal Reserve in that it was like, you know, you have like a 5-person leading committee, and 2 of the 5 are leading businessmen and bankers, and 3 of the 5 are political bureaucrats. And so it's private and public, but it's definitely under a planned economy. And England did this. England had a national bank. So there it is again, right? He's trying to mimic the English mercantilist system, as opposed to becoming a good capitalist as the Secretary of the Treasury. And then with that, and then he got involved. He was very vocal in political discourse, and he got involved with things that were not immediately of his own interest, like with the president's ability to remove people from his cabinet, because it says, right, that the president can place people in his cabinet, but it doesn't say that he can remove them. And so he was very vocal in saying that it is implied, the language implies that because he can't appoint them, he could also remove them. And to the libertarians, you know, the idea of implied powers, that's scary, right? Because if you're libertarian, you're naturally going to be oftentimes a strict constructionalist. You're going to say, hey, if it is not explicitly stated in the Constitution, then the political leaders cannot and should not do it. So the implied powers, that really is going to broaden what the government can or cannot do. He had no problem with the president ceasing to meet with Congress over foreign diplomacy. George Washington started really unilaterally doing his own thing with foreign diplomacy increasingly, because at the very beginning of his first tenure, he went and spoke to the Senate, because, right, it says that the president is to engage in, treaties and foreign diplomacy with the advice and consent of the Senate. Well, he asked for the advice and consent of the Senate just one time, and he did not like the response he got. And so after that, he began just giving them written letters saying what he was up to, and not really asking for their advice any longer, nor their consent. And so Hamilton, not being afraid of being in the middle of confrontation and being in the middle of publicity, he made it clear that he sided with President Washington and having, more power than was explicitly stated in the Constitution under the executive Article 2. And so that's going to manifest itself, you guys, in the Ohio Valley. In the Ohio Valley, President Washington is going to send at least 2 military governors into the Great Lakes area of Michigan, Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio. And that land is going to be a hotly contested region of land. You're going to have a multiplicity of tribes. And then you're going to have the fact that the Iroquois tribe was granted in a treaty that land over that as conquest by the British. And then, of course, the tribes are going to say, but hey, we're no longer under Great Britain, so that shouldn't be recognized by the new American government, right? But then the Northwest Ordinances, remember those? They were seen as a vestige of the Articles of Confederation, where they were to send the land survey office there and put everything under 6 square acre mile plots and have it developed into cities and counties and future states. But they had to contend with Native Americans, obviously. And so Washington is going to controversially send military governors into that region and encourage them and give them a free hand in trying to purchase as much land and survey as much land as possible from the Native Americans for future development into states. And he's going to have rebellions on his hand. And you can look up a guy named Anthony Wayne, W-A-Y-N-E. They called him Mad Wayne. He's going to declare war on the Native Americans, and there's going to be bloodshed in that area. And all this is going to happen, a lot of this is going to happen without the advice and consent of the Senate, right? As seems to be implied in the original Constitution. So Hamilton is going to give his okay to this, right? Like I said, Hamilton, he had that type of personality whereby he not only did not shy away from confrontation and from polarizing subjects, but he almost relished it in making enemies And that goes into great man history of Hamilton when you read biographies on him. In one case, matter of fact, he said something and he got a great applause. And he turned to one of his advisors and said, "Did I just say something foolish?" Because such was his sense of elitism that he expected the most rational, intelligent stance on any given issue to be the unpopular stance. He expected the majority of people to be against the reasonable option. And so he almost questioned himself when he had a popular stance. Just a little funny side note. And so at any rate, you have this national bank. He's going to use the implied power suggestion. And then he also, right, is Congress is going to declare these appellate courts underneath the Supreme Court. But he is going to be an advocate for to make it clear that from Article 3, state court decisions can and ought to be submitted to the Supreme Court where the Supreme Court has original jurisdiction. So remember, it says clearly where the Supreme Court has original jurisdiction in Article 3 of the Constitution, a conflict between a citizen of one state versus a citizen of another state, one state government versus a citizen of another state, the United States government and a citizen of another government, et cetera, right? So under those original jurisdiction openings, he wanted the Supreme Court to have more power to overturn the lesser court's decisions. And remember, him wanting to have the utmost power for the Supreme Court was controversial to the left, because the Supreme Court are rich, white, educated men who were handpicked for life, right? Arguably the least democratic facet to the government of the three branches. And here he is advocating their autonomy and their strength, this Supreme Court body. And then he also had his lawyers defend the national bank under, not only did they flirt with the idea of implied powers, that it was implied to have this national bank, but also the necessary and proper clause, right? That it shall be done whatever is necessary and proper to carry out any of the given powers of the federal government. And so that was a scary clause to the libertarians. And so his national bank, his bond certificate program with the wealthy, his taking over the budgets of the states, his taxes, and then of course there was a whiskey rebellion. And some people thought, like Jefferson, that you ought to give just a slight slap of the wrist for any type of rebellion, because it shows, like from the works of Machiavelli and others, that the people are vigilant, that they're awake, that they're jealous of their rights, and that it's a good thing to have some rebellions and protests, etc., according to the rhetoric of Jefferson. But in doing so, that's not what Washington's government did. Is they cracked down on this whiskey rebellion. They raised an army that was larger, 13,000 man army, that was larger than the Continental Army almost ever had been, against its own people. And so all these things alienated a lot of people who were at the left of the spectrum and even in the center, who felt and received the image that Washington's administration was too far to the right. And then you had John Jay's treaty, where we kissed up to the English and did not get any concessions from them that a lot of public Americans felt we were entitled to, like freely trading in the Caribbean, telling the British to get out of their forts in the Ohio Valley that they had promised to evacuate, keeping us from having the same equal opportunities of trade with Great Britain because they were being punitive toward us after the War for Independence. And John Jay's treaty rectified none of those injustices. So it looked like Washington's administration was an Anglophile administration, a lover of all things English. Okay. So an oppositional party will erupt. Yeah, that's what you get with number one. Then with number two, you have John Adams, and this is court history. This is our first one-term president, and the writer David McCullough defends him and says that he was a one-term president because he was too honest for his own good. He had too much personal integrity for his own good. He didn't play the political game of just blindly following one faction or one political party, whether he agreed with all of its facets of its platform or not. This guy made up his own mind on every given issue, and in so doing, he made enemies on both the left and the right. All right. So that's why I think it was a court history, his biography on John Adams. I think it's praising him and defending him as a one-term president. So those on the right, those on the left, they had plenty of reason not to like him. Remember, he had pretty much said the masses are asses. He was more afraid of a democratic uprising than he was of a cadre of an elite educated few. He, like Hamilton, was in some ways too honest for his own good as a politician, and alienated a lot of people on the left as being an elitist, right? The French Revolution, when it happened, he made it very clear his opposition to it. Because one of the most salient characteristics of him, when you read this biography, is John Adams was a very vocal Christian. And after the Gironde lost power of the French Revolution and it went into the hands of the Jacobins, the French Revolution became, for lack of a better adjective, very radical. They attacked the Roman Catholic Church. They declared year one of reason and got rid of the Gregorian calendar based on the time of Christ, and declared year one of reason. They dispossessed the nobility and called them traitors to the class and put them under these mock kangaroo trials, where it was clear that they were going to be found guilty just by identity, not by any action or infringement upon any particular law, but for being members of the nobility. It virtually became a crime to be such, right? And they had mass from these kangaroo trials. They began declaring the nobility enemies of the state and having them publicly executed. So John Adams made it clear, because Thomas Jefferson and some of the liberals said, "See, this is what we were supposed to do in our American Revolution, is adhere fully to the French Enlightenment. And our cousins in the French Revolution are doing just that. We ought to praise them, and we ought to finish the revolution here." That was a type of like almost dangerous sounding rhetoric that Jefferson wrote and spoke at times, right? John Adams, no way. John Adams said, this is of the devil. They're going against the Catholic Church. They are bloodthirsty. It's too extreme. They're declaring class warfare, etc. So he armed our Navy to a convoy system to protect our merchant ships from the French Continental Navy, which was taking merchant ships' goods that they were trying to trade with the enemy. Okay. So like English Trinidad and Tobago and Jamaica, etc. But notice, does Article 2 say anything that he could do that? Remember that the Congress is supposed to raise an army and a navy. Congress is supposed to commandeer state militia into a national body of troops. And Congress is to declare war. Then only then is the president to become commander in chief and send boys to their death. He went around all that. He circumvented all of that and caused what was called a quasi or almost war against Napoleonic France, French Revolutionary France. All right, in the 1790s. Then the Alien and Sedition Acts by his Federalist Congress. The Alien Act gave the president power to deport French radicals. Because you're going to have, right, like Citizen Genet, Genet, and other representatives of the French Revolution come and visit the United States and try to enlist Americans to come help fight in the Continental War against the Triple Alliance of England, Prussia, of Germany, and Austria, and help fight with their French cousins. And remember, we technically were under a military treaty still with France and helping us in the war for independence. So they made that clear as well. So now the president has been given the power by Congress to deport radical French immigrants. And who constitutionally has power over immigration and naturalization? Congress. They're giving that power to the president. That upsets the system of checks and balances. All this is alienating the left and making the left think that John Adams is too dangerously on the right. And the Sedition Acts. Anything that incited the hatred of the good people of the United States for the federal government was punishable by fine or even incarceration. This was a very scary infringement on the First Amendment right of the press and expression and to peacefully protest the government. And what looked bad is there was a guy named Philip Freneau, Freneau, and he was known in his Gazette newspaper to really tear into the Federalists, and he was arrested under this. So it looked like John Adams was just using this constitutionally dubious legislation to shut up the opposition. All right. But at the same time, it stated that John Adams alienated himself from the right, and that he did not, you look at numbers, they were pretty negligible. Number of convictions under and deportations under the Alien and Sedition Acts. He didn't enforce them very vigorously at all. And there's evidence that he had a problem with them on his conscience, knowing that they were both constitutionally dubious. He also would not go to war against France. He did the quasi-war, but he continued to allow up to 3 different ambassadors to meet with revolutionary French leaders to try to keep the peace with them. And the members on the right wanted to go to war against revolutionary France, and he wouldn't do it. Then there was Fry's Rebellion, and the right wanted to make an example of him, where I'm sorry, it's been a long time since I had read a Fry's Rebellion, but there was a protest. Then there was a protest meeting to imprisonment of some people, and at that protest, things turned deadly, and some police officers lost their lives. The right wanted him executed, John Fries. But instead, as a lawyer for most of his adult life, John Adams looked into it and had him pardoned and said he did not do anything to explicitly promote violence against authorities. Also, in alienating himself from the right, he wanted to recognize Haiti the Republic of Haiti because he was rather liberal when it came to race relations and slavery. He was largely opposed to it. And in Haiti, right, I'll try, but I'm going to butcher the guy's name, but Toussaint Louverture, a Haitian slave, educated slave, started a mass slave rebellion on the island of Haiti, and Dominican Republic shared by it, right? And on the corner of where it's Haiti, they are going to succeed in issuing a new constitution for a new Black republic in the Caribbean of ex-slaves. This scared the heck out of the South and a lot of conservatives. And he wanted to recognize Haiti as this new Black republic. And the explanation for all this is very perhaps simplistically stated by McCullough, was basically John Adams' religion. Is first and foremost, he saw himself as a Christian who had to answer to God when he died. And he wanted to make the wisest, most virtuous decision on every given issue, not caring who he would alienate on the left or the right. And then lastly, also, is he made enemies of Alexander Hamilton, who was largely, considered his most powerful possible ally on the right. But he thought, and it wasn't against his policies, it wasn't ideological. I've yet to read anything about him thinking, that he went too far with the National Bank, with his, any of the other parts of his system. But he thought Alexander Hamilton was a vain peacock, he called him. Said that he was out for himself and his own glory, and he was dangerous as a politician and not to be trusted. So he made a powerful enemy out of, and let's face it too, John Adams was known for having a very short temper. He didn't suffer fools well. That literally an adjective often ascribed in his biographies is irritable, very easily angered and annoyed. And so he made enemies on both sides, and hence he became our first one-term president. Okay. Number 3, I want you to read and infer yourself, because it's pretty simple. And not only that, I just the element of just, if you have yet to read it, I think you'll enjoy it. Not the writing itself, which I did, which could have been much better, but the message. The message is a cool message. It's by an historian named Richard Hofstadter from the 1950s and 60s. And basically, it's a psychological thesis tied to Jefferson's childhood with his mom and dad, stating that the way that his mom, his image of his own mom and his desire to please his own dad caused him to want to be seen and see himself as a champion of the people, of the common man. So you're going to see a degree of wealth guilt here. Whereas Hamilton was born in obscurity, right? Orphaned, a rags to riches story. He then becomes very elitist by his own words and behavior later on. Jefferson was born with a silver spoon in his mouth. His mom was British royalty. And he's going to go out of his way to try to prove that he does not put on airs, and he is the champion of the common, poor American person. So look into that, okay? I think it's fascinating. His mommy and daddy thesis. All right. And then number 4, I got this basically from the textbook. Is Jefferson and like Woodrow Wilson. There are just a couple or a few presidents who, when you're doing the narrative of their biographies, you find a very curious contradiction between what they practiced and what they preached. And Jefferson is one of those few. He hated and wanted to kill Hamilton's system. But when he became president, his Secretary of the Treasury said, "We can't do it, sir. Too many loans out to too many sources. It will be economically disastrous to let go of this system." So he leaves it intact, despite all his previous to becoming president, railing against it. He keeps Hamilton's system intact. He wants a crusade against ignorance. He wants a public educational system to educate the people so that they can participate in government with some wisdom and virtue, right? With a classical education. But largely the planter class in the South and the States say no. So it never materializes. He stated that a president, congressman, any political official for the federal government can and should never do anything which is not explicitly stated in the Constitution for them to do. Because remember, he was libertarian, right, in his rhetoric before becoming president. But he ironically buys the Louisiana Territory from Napoleon without even consulting with the Senate, and then gets the Senate afterwards to approve it, right? Then, being the Democratic champion that he is, he doesn't allow Democratic government to be established in that Louisiana Territory, because the Cajuns, the Creoles, the Native Americans, the Spaniards, and the other demographics of people there, he said, are not accustomed to self-government and are not prepared for that. And there's a guy named Wilkinson who was part of a conspiracy to sell this land to a foreign country. And there was a publicized trial and everything. General Wilkinson and Aaron Burr, the infamous Aaron Burr. So he didn't want to take that chance. So he puts 21 hand-picked men in the northern section of the territory and 21 hand-picked men in the southern section of the territory to rule over it before they become states in the future. He sends Meriwether Lewis while he's trying to negotiate the land, across the land, right? 1803. Meriwether Lewis seemed to embody his intellectual curiosity. He brought with him bones of mastodons that had been excavated and found, the flora and fauna of the different territories, lots of written descriptions that were just, because clearly, whatever you think of Thomas Jefferson, he clearly was a man of much intellectual curiosity. And he was very curious about this land he was trying to buy. But then Clark, right, of the Lewis and Clark expedition, Clark gives him back numbers, tribes that are either hostile or friendly, how many warriors they had, what trade goods they likely would be open to. So Clark, as Meriwether Lewis, and I hope that I'm not making a gross simplification of the two, but to me, Meriwether Lewis personifies the intellectual curiosity of Jefferson, but Clark makes it look like it's a military spying expedition, right? And trying to see just who can be bought off, who is going to need to be fought against amongst the Native American tribes. And I kid you not, Clark would meet them and say, "Greetings from your great white father, Jefferson." So that's ironic, right? And then in his Declaration of Independence, Jefferson resented a powerful executive who, without a declaration of war, without raising of an army, and without a just cause, but I kid you not, he normally would say, but for reasons of vanity. And vanity, right? Like pride, wounded pride, that kings would send soldiers to war to fight and die for such trivial reasons as their offended honor, without congressional, without legislative cooperation and permission. And he does just that in North Africa. There was a Pasha, Pasha, named Yusuf Karamanli. And he was engaging in piracy and extortion in the Mediterranean. And American citizens were suffering from it. This greatly offended Thomas Jefferson. So he sends a man named William Eaton, E-A-T-O-N, with money from the federal government to Egypt to find Yusuf's brother Ahmed and raise an army and overthrow Yusuf. So he's planning a military coup against a foreign ruler without Congress, without the collaboration of Congress. It does not work. But he tries it nevertheless. And then he sends the USS Philadelphia to punish the Pasha of Tripoli. And they succumbed to a trap. They went after a couple little skiffs that they could have easily defeated, but it brought them upon a reef, and they got caught on land. And they were captured and held for ransom. And it got tons of press that about 100 Marines are now captured in Tripoli, and they might be sold to infamous Istanbul as slaves if a ransom is not paid. Then and only then he gets Congress involved in trying to do something about it. And then and only then Congress, in trying to get him out of this mess, they send a guy named Stephen Decatur and a couple other war heroes and a couple of U.S. ships and frigates over to try to rescue them. They had limited military success, and eventually we are going to purchase their freedom. All with the exception of, funny little side note, of one of the Marines who decided to convert to Islam for his freedom. And he became like a police type figure over the rest of the POWs and mistreated them. And long after they got back, they were trying to campaign to get him caught and brought back to the US and punished. But this was known as the Tripolitan War. And Jefferson got us heavily involved long before Congress had any part to do with it. So you see all these contradictions with Jefferson between what he practiced and what he preached. And then slavery. We know from not only the Declaration of Independence, but in his correspondence with the French aristocrat, it would be published by a friend of his, supposedly unbeknownst to him, and he didn't like it, but and then printed out in his note on Notes on the State of Virginia. You could buy it and check it out. But it became known as Notes on the State of Virginia. And he sounds very liberal in a lot of his writings. Amongst them, very enlightened in his opposition to slavery. But at any given time, he kept 160 odd slaves, did not free them, contended that his generation wasn't ready for that. And so that he would be the benevolent leader who treated them like family on his own plantation at Monticello. He had written, I kid you not, that an example of the unhealthy relationship between slaves and their masters, he said, what better example is there when there is a romantic liaison between a master and one of his female slaves? Because he says, after all, right, she has to become a sycophant. A sycophant, right, is like someone who is at the mercy of the person in power and is prone to just be a yes man or yes woman and use flattery and dishonesty to try to forward his or her own agenda. Says, after all, what's the black slave woman going to say? No. Well, guess what? He develops a romantic relationship with Sally Hemings. And they have 4 kids that grow into adulthood, biracial kids. And when the news of it came out, his elderless Beverly was turning 18 and had been promised to be freed at 18. And he told Beverly, sorry, I can't do it. We got to wait for the storm to subside. And so Beverly ran away. And we have no evidence of them seeing each other again after that. So he would not take a public stand for his relationship with Sally Hemings. He would take her to France where he knew that he could enjoy and demonstrate his love and affection for her, which seemed to have been somewhat genuine because they were more progressive in France on race relations. But back here in the States, he would take no such stance. He promised her if she would return with him, because she threatened to stay in France, that if she returned with him, that he promised to give freedom to all their kids, which he did. He had a son that he was very fond of named Eston, but he encouraged Eston to separate himself from all this drama and go out and pursue his musical career. And so it's just sad. It's a sad, sad story and very ironic. So notice in each of these cases, right, we're not saying, Brinkley in the textbook is not saying that simply Thomas Jefferson was a hypocrite. He's not saying, as he could have, that he changed with power, right? That power changes people, or that he changed in age. Some people convey the thesis that people become more conservative in age. But he states, right, that Jefferson was one of the least confrontational human beings that have ever been documented in history. This guy was scared to death of confrontation. There's evidence to support that. And so that when he became president, he faced what he perceived to be too strong of opposition in circumstances to adhere to his own philosophy. And so he begrudgingly became a pragmatist instead of an idealist, who he tended to be before becoming president. Remember, to me, an idealist is someone who doesn't see the world as it is, but as it ought to be, and wants to improve it and has a grand vision for the world that's much better than the status quo. And a pragmatist says, hey, I'm going to live in the here and now. I'm going to deal with the dirty situation I'm in, and I'm going to choose lesser evils. And I'm going to make practical decisions. So supposedly forces that Jefferson considered too large and powerful for himself convinced him to become a pragmatist. And that's his explanation for Jefferson violating his own rhetoric time and time again. But I hope, if I did even a decent job on this, I hope that it has elicited some type of curiosity among you, that if you ever do get the chance on the side to read a little great man history of any of these first 3 presidents, George Washington, feisty little John Adams, or the very, very curious, paradoxical, bashful Thomas Jefferson? Okay, so are there any questions? Can I get a thumbs up? You guys okay? Feel fairly decent on the material?
I'm good.
Thank you, Alonda.
Mhm.
Thank you. All right. Okay, well, if it's okay with you, I'm going to go ahead and let you go. Remember, we will not meet on Tuesday. We're like 3 assignments ahead. So at least on Tuesday, we're not going to meet. And I will let you know via a Canvas message if we do meet on Thursday or not. Okay.
Sounds good.
All right. So thank you guys. I have your names down. You'll get your extra credit. You guys have a good weekend.
Thanks, you too.
Thank you.
All right.